Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 17, Adolphe Edouard Casimir Joseph Mortier, Marshal, Duke of Treviso.
Edouard Mortier was born near Cambrai on February 13, 1768. His father, a prosperous farmer, gave the future marshal a fair education. Becoming a man of some importance on the outbreak of the Revolution, he was able in 1791 to secure for his son a commission in the volunteer cavalry of the North. Extremely tall, heavily built, slow of speech, with a stupid sentinel look, the yeoman captain of 1791 gave the casual observer but little sign of promise. But in spite of those rather weary-looking eyes, young Mortier was possessed of a burning enthusiasm and a dauntless courage. From his first engagement at Quievron in April 1792, where he had a horse killed under him, to the day he and Marmont surrendered Paris in 1814, every skirmish or engagement in which he took part bore testimony to his extraordinary bodily strength and bravery. Nature having also endowed him with a kindly temperament, it was not to be wondered at that his men swore by him and were ready to follow him anywhere. But in spite of many gallant actions and numerous mentions in dispatches, promotion came but slowly. For Mortier spent the first 6 years of his service with the armies of the Sambre and Meuse and of the Rhine, and had to compete against such men as SOULT, Ney, Saint-Cyr, Kleber, and Desailles, who were on a higher mental plane. Still, he was recognized as one who was bound to rise, and was one of those whom Kleber singled out for commendation when he wrote to the Directory, saying, "With such chiefs a general can neglect to count the number of his enemies." And well he might, for on the day after he wrote his report, Mortier, with a single battalion and 4 squadrons of cavalry, having been ordered to try and drive 2,000 of the enemy out of a strong position on the Wysant, attacked them with such vivacity that, to the surprise of everybody, in an hour he drove them in flight. After the campaign in 1798, Jourdan sent up his name for the command of a brigade. But he preferred the colonelcy of the 21st Regiment of Cavalry. However, a few months later, on February 22nd, he was promoted general of brigade. It was in this capacity that he served under MASSÉNA in the celebrated campaign in Switzerland. At the Second Battle of Zurich, he did yeoman service. By a vigorous demonstration, he held the enemy near the town, while MASSÉNA completed his turning movement. He further distinguished himself by his vigor and resource during the pursuit of the Russians. Thus he won his promotion to General of Division on September 25, 1799. When Bonaparte became first consul, Mortier found no cause for dissatisfaction with the change of government. No politician, he was ready to accept any strong government. Fortunately for him, his dogged character and his fighting record attracted the first consul's attention. Bonaparte saw in him a man without guile, a soldier who would accept any order from his chief and execute it instantly without questioning. Still, it was a great piece of fortune for the general of division, who had hitherto held no independent command in the field, that he lay with his troops near the Vaal, at the time that the first consul determined to punish England for her suspicion of him by seizing Hanover. With 20,000 men, General Mortier, issued from Holland, fell suddenly on the Hanoverian troops at Borstal on the Weser, and forced Count Walmoden to sign a convention whereby the Hanoverian army was to retire behind the Elbe and not to bear arms against the French as long as the war continued. The English government refused to ratify it, so Mortier at once called on Walmoden to resume hostilities. But so unequal was the contest that the Hanoverian general was forced to accept a modified form of the former convention. Thereon, Mortier hurriedly occupied Hamburg and Bremen and closed the Elbe to English commerce. But brilliant as his operations had been in the field, as military governor of the ceded provinces he established a reputation for great rapacity which followed him throughout his career. Napoleon, however, winked at his general's peculations so long as they did not affect his treasury, and he showed his approbation of his successful campaign by making him one of the 4 commandants of the Guard, and including him, in 1804, among the first creation of marshals. Next year, Mortier marched to Germany in command of a division of the Guards. When after Ulm, the army was reorganized for the advance on Vienna, a new corps, composed of the division of Dupont and Gazin, was entrusted to the marshal. The duty he was to perform was difficult. He was to cross the Danube at Linz and, unsupported save by a flotilla of boats, hang on the Russian rear, while the rest of the army marched on Vienna by the right bank of the river. The emperor impressed on him the necessity for caution and warned him that he must throw out a ring of vedettes and keep somewhat behind Lanz's corps, which was marching in advance of him on the other side of the river. Unfortunately, the marshal, in his eagerness to inflict loss on the Russians, whom he believed to be flying in complete rout, neglected all warnings and pushed recklessly forward. At Dürrenstein, near the castle where Richard Coeur de Lion was imprisoned by the Archduke of Austria, he fell into a trap. The enemy allowed him to pass the defile of Dürrenstein with Gazin's division, knowing that Dupont was many miles in the rear, and then closed in on him on front and rear. With but 7,000 men, surrounded by 30,000 Russians, it seemed that the marshal was lost. But he kept his head, and at once turned about to try and break back and join Dupont, who he knew would hurry to his support. Firing at point-blank range, struggling bayonet against bayonet, the small French force worked its way towards the defile. Darkness fell, but still the fight continued, and at last Dupont's guns were heard at the other side of the gorge. But by then 2/3 of Gazin's division had fallen, 3 eagles were taken, and Mortier himself, conspicuous by his towering height, owed his safety to his skill with his saber. His officers had begged him to escape across the river by boat, lest a Marshal of France should become a prisoner in the hands of the despised Russians. This he indignantly refused. "No," he said, "reserve this resource for the wounded. One who has the honor to command such brave soldiers should esteem himself happy to share their lot and perish with them. We have still 2 guns and some boxes of grape. Let us close our ranks and make a last effort." But still the Russians pressed the devoted column, and now all the ammunition was expended and the survivors were preparing to sell their lives dearly, when Dupont's men at last hurled the enemy aside. And amid cries of, "France! France! You have saved us!" the undaunted remnant of Gazin's division threw themselves into the arms of their comrades. On the morrow, the sorely battered corps was recalled across the Danube, but the emperor could not lay all the blame on Mortier, for it was his own mistake in strategy in dividing his army by the broad Danube which had really caused the disaster. In 1806, the marshal acted independently on the left of the Grand Army, and after occupying Kassel and Hamburg, where his cruel exactions greatly increased his reputation for rapacity, he was entrusted with the operations against the Swedes. In 1807, however, he was called up to reinforce the Grand Army in time to take part in the decisive battle at Friedland. In July 1808, Napoleon rewarded him by creating him Duke of Treviso. A month later, he dispatched him to Spain in command of the 5th Corps, which was composed of veterans of the Austrian and Prussian campaigns, very different from the recruits of the 3rd Corps and other corps in Spain. But in spite of this magnificent material, the marshal did not distinguish himself. The severe reverse he had received at Dürrenstein seemed to have killed his dash. His physical bravery remained the same as ever, but his moral courage had deteriorated. And in Spain, his maneuvers were always halting and timid. At Saragossa, he did not press the siege with the vehemence Lannes showed when he superseded him. But at the Battle of Ocaña, he showed that during a combat his nerve was as good as ever. The first lines of the French, broken by the fire of the Spanish battery, had begun to waver. The marshal was slightly wounded, but at the critical moment he rode up to Girard's division, which was in reserve, and leading it through the intervals of the first line, he caught the victorious enemy at a disadvantage and completely turned the fortunes of the day. The remainder of the Duke of Treviso's service in the peninsula was spent under the command of Marshal Soult, either in front of Cadiz or as a covering force to the troops occupied in that siege. From Spain, he was recalled in 1812 to command the Young Guard in the Russian campaign. When the French evacuated Moscow, the marshal, at the emperor's commands, had the invidious duty of blowing up the Kremlin. During his retreat, he showed himself worthy of his post of commander of the Young Guard, and in 1813, in the same capacity, he fought throughout the campaign, taking his share in the battles of Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden, Leipzig, and Hanau. After Dresden, he incurred, along with St. Cyr, the wrath of the emperor for not having aided Vandamme. But the fact remains that the blame of the disaster at Culm rests entirely on Napoleon and Vandamme. No orders were sent to Mortier or St. Cyr till after the disaster had occurred, and Vandamme had not taken the most elementary precautions against surprise. In 1814, the Marshal fought gallantly at Montmirail and Troyes, but, like Victor and Ney, he showed but little ingenuity. When Napoleon made his last dash eastward, he left Mortier and Marmont to hold off the Prussians from Paris. The Duke of Treviso, though far senior to the Duke of Ragusa, bowed to his superior genius, and in the operations ending in the surrender of Paris, he carried out his junior's ideas with great generosity and without the least show of jealousy. Like the rest of the marshals, the Duke of Treviso made his submission to the new government. On the return of Napoleon, he for a time kept true to his oath to the Bourbons. When the Duke of Orleans, who shared with him the command of the North, on leaving Lille, wrote to him, "I am too good a Frenchman to sacrifice the interests of France, because now misfortune compels me to quit it. I go to hide myself in retirement and oblivion. It only remains for me to release you from all the orders which I have given you, and to recommend you to do what your excellent judgment and patriotism may suggest as best for the interests of France." The Marshal, in spite of his decoration of St. Louis and his seat as a peer of France, once again returned to his old allegiance. The Emperor greeted him warmly and created him one of his new peers, and in June sent him to the frontier in command of the Young Guard. But an attack of sciatica forcing him to bed, he escaped the disaster of Waterloo. On the second restoration, he lost for the time his honors and dignities, but refused to repurchase them at the price of sitting as judge on Marshal Ney. However, in 1819, he was reinstated in all of them. It was not till the accession of the July monarchy that the Duke of Treviso once again played a prominent part. In 1831, his old friend, the Duke of Orleans, now become king, made him Grand Chancellor of the Legion of Honor, and in November 1834 called on him to accept the onerous task of head of the government and Minister of War. To help his friend and sovereign, the Duke accepted the responsibility, but soon found that he was unequal to the task. A frank and loyal soldier of unimpeachable honor, integrity, and character, he could shine in the field, but not in the forum. His fine, lofty figure, commanding air, military bearing, and frankness were of no avail in the Chamber of Peers, where what was wanted was a subtle spirit which could discern and influence the drift of parties, a clear, facile tongue, and an apparent acquaintance with any subject which might come up for discussion. These were the very qualities in which the Marshal was most lacking. Slow-witted by nature, with a limited vocabulary and a bad delivery, he soon found himself unfitted for the post, and resigned in February 1835. But unfortunately for him, he still retained his position as Grand Chancellor, and in this capacity he attended Louis Philippe on his way to the ill-fated review of July 29th. As the procession arrived at the Boulevard of the Temple, the Marshal complained of the heat. His staff tried to persuade the old soldier to go home, but he refused, saying, "My place is by the king, in the midst of the marshals, my comrades in arms." Scarcely had he spoken when Fieschi hurled the fatal bomb, which missed the king and the princes, but killed the marshal and many another soldier. The Duke of Treviso, while doing his duty by his sovereign, met his death like a soldier, though not on the field of battle. As with Davout, the key to his character was his dogged determination. But though he resembled the Prince of Eckmühl on the battlefield, he had not his powers of organization, nor his clear insight into matters of policy and strategy. But he had other qualities which Davout lacked. He was kind-hearted and beloved by his men. His simplicity and faithfulness appealed to Napoleon and to all who came in contact with him, and it was for this reason that the Emperor entrusted him with the Young Guard. What distinguished him from many of the other marshals was his lack of jealousy and the generous way in which he cooperated with his comrades in arms. When the funeral procession passed down the Rue Royale on its way to the Church of the Invalides, with 4 marshals on horseback holding the corners of the pall, men felt, and felt rightly, that France had suffered a loss. For one was gone who, peasant-born, had in his high position known how to retain the simple virtues of a peasant, whose one vice was the peasant vice of avarice, and who, with this exception, had never allowed place or power to interfere with what he thought was his duty.
This concludes Chapter 17 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 18, about Jean Bessieres. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.